In this section of the workshop, we're going to use a framework to build the same application, essentially. And what we would like you to do is to actually do it yourself this time. So who is ready to write some code? Ooh, yeah, great. All right, let's make it happen. All right, so what I'll do first, I'll show you the end result so you know what you're building. And I will also take you through some intro slides so you know exactly the kind of environment you will work with. So on the left, and because it's a hybrid app, I needed two devices. So since I have only one, it's a hybrid app, so I can test it in the browser as I mentioned it before. So this is the application, essentially a list of sessions here. And I can do this and select the details. So as I mentioned before, just to practice, and we needed to pick one. And so this is using Ionic on top of AngularJS. So all these components, the UI components, like this is a card in Ionic, all that is out of the box, including the headers, the navigations. Now you don't have to worry about all these things that we mentioned this morning, whether it's hardware accelerated or not, because it is. It's out of the box in the framework. So all these things, like for instance here, that left side menu is also component out of the box, available as a component. So you can look at the speakers and get pictures and stuff like that. So that's all good. And so what I can also do is log in to kind of engage more socially inside the application. And so as you can imagine, you can create an account with the application, but to make it more social, you can also log in with Facebook. So let's see if that works. I have some debug code here, that's all good. And because I was already logged in with Facebook, it's really simply letting me in. And now if I go here under profile, it goes pick up my picture from Facebook and potentially some additional information from Facebook. And now, if I picked a session here, I'm not going to do it, you will do it. I could share it on Facebook, but my Facebook friends are tired of me polluting my feed with all my test data. But you'll do it, and it's going to work for you. The other thing that you can do, and that's a little more advanced, is as I said before, push notification has become a really important part of a mobile app. And you need to use that carefully because you don't want to spam your users with non-stop messages. But at the same time, if used correctly, it's a way to remind people, your user base, of your application, notify them about important things. So what I did here, just as an example, and once you're done with your application, I'll go through the technical implementation of that. But so we'll see if this works here. When I like a session here in my app, I want my friends to know that I like that session, okay? Oops, that was the wrong, okay. All right, gonna have to do this, because you can't see my important. All right, here we go. All right, and so I'm going to like this session. Let's do it. And here you go. You see automatically, boom, check out this session, immediate push notification from the app to my phone, and you can potentially send that only to your friends, since I'm connected to Facebook. So this is really something that you really need to think about, because if your app doesn't do that, it's kind of less engaging for your users. So that's essentially what you'll build. So simple you know, kind of master detail with nice out-of-the-box components. Facebook integration and then push notification. I have to let you know, though, that you will probably not be able to fully implement push notification because depending on the platform you want to do it on, you need to get certificates, and to get an Apple certificate, as you know, you need to be a member of the developer program. So I'll walk you through it, and you probably won't be able to fully implement it today. So I'll cover that, you know, in the next part of the presentation, but you can either build your own admin service, which I will do. I'll build a small like Node.js application to handle that. Or there are third-party services like Urban Airship and services like that that you can use as well. And I'll try to, you know, explain how that works. But for you to really understand the steps involved, I want to show you a completely custom implementation of that. All right. So what I will also do, since we are building hybrid apps, remember my presentation that I was running on the iPad this morning to show you kind of API examples in action. Well, I'll continue to run it in the browser this time because I don't really have you know, APIs to demonstrate, so it's totally fine to do that in the browser. So we spoke about this this morning, so you know the difference between full stack and kind of build your own custom stack. People ask me all the time, well, so, you know, help me, what's the best one? And there is really no answer to that, but again, I want to give you some points of reference here. Some of these frameworks have a very different philosophy, and you have your own philosophy, and, you know, then you'll pick the framework that works the way you like a framework to work. So for instance, I want to contrast two of them that I think have a completely different philosophy, and that's Backbone that you see there on the bottom left, and Angular, or also like a native SDK, like for instance the native iOS SDK. And so I position these things on two axes. You know, the first one is how prescriptive is the framework, and by prescriptive I mean, does it really guide you into doing things a certain way, the framework way, okay? And I think, like, if you look at native applications and the native iOS SDK, for instance, you know, you are really on Rails. You kind of have to do things the way, you know, they think you should build apps. And Angular, in many ways, is very similar. It's kind of, you know, it's very powerful, but you build apps in a certain way. And the opposite of that, on that axis, the x-axis, is Backbone, which essentially gives you a bunch of guidelines, utilities, but it's not prescriptive at all. You build it the way you really want. They don't, you know, you're really free to do whatever you want. And so it's hard for me to say, you know, this approach is better than the other approach, because sometimes you really want complete freedom, and sometimes you want to be guided and you know, do it the way the framework authors wanted you to write the application. The second axis that I find interesting too is how declarative the framework is. And by declarative, I specifically mean how do you annotate HTML if you do it at all? And so there are some frameworks who don't want to touch HTML because they feel like, you know, HTML is what it is, and you should simply use what is provided. But you can actually extend HTML and annotate existing tag, potentially even create your own tags. And again, if you use Backbone out of the box, there is nothing declarative. Backbone doesn't touch HTML at all. It's purely a JavaScript framework. If you look at Angular, it's full of HTML annotations that mostly are called directives, okay? And so you can do a lot. It's super powerful, right? Because you can do binding that way, you can do all sorts of things. It's declarative. Some people love that, some people not so much. So again, it's a matter of preference. But for the sake of this example, we're going to we're going to work with AngularJS and Ionic. How many people here have used AngularJS at all? Wow. Ooh, that's really an impressive, impressive number. How many people have used Ionic? Just a little less, but still a pretty good number. So that's really interesting. Okay, so I'm going to be very quick here for people who are less familiar with these two frameworks, and then we will let you experiment with the framework. So Angular is a couple of things, but mostly it provides structure to your application. So it's essentially an MVC framework with cool features like dependency injection. We spoke about that this morning. Directives, I just mentioned that. So you know, custom annotations like ng model, for instance, to do binding and stuff like that. So you can create your own directives. So you can essentially extend the component model, extend HTML in many ways. I mentioned data binding, and it has templates built in, so you don't have to use yet another library. So essentially, I'm going to try to very quickly look at the skeleton, if you want, of a basic Angular application. And again, then you'll build your own. So, you know, typically with Angular, you're going to write modules. And you start with an application module. And so there is that syntax, Angular module, that is the name of your module. And then that array is actually your dependencies. So these are the modules that your application depends on. Okay? So using AngularJS, basically modules are built in, so you don't necessarily have to use something like required.js or other solutions like that, because the whole module thing is essentially built in. And then you basically annotate, in this case, the body of your application to say, okay, you know, this is the scope, this is the app that I'm going to work with. And now body is aware of a lot of things that are defined in your application. So you create an application with two dependencies here, controllers, a bunch of controllers, and services, a bunch of services. We will see what that looks like. So let's look at services first. So this is essentially your data access layer. All right, and in this case, we're going to work with a bunch of REST services, and Angular has that cool module that you then add as a dependency that's called ng resource, and it's essentially a kind of a higher level way to do REST services. There is also, and you'll see it, I think in the lab, there is also a lower level $HTTP service that you can use. That's lower level. That one is very similar to the $AJAX in jQuery. ng resource is a little higher level, and you can work very easily with REST services. So I'm going to define, in this case, two REST services, product and offer. This is a slightly different application, but this could be, you know, session and speakers. And you basically define the endpoints of your services. Now, obviously, this is super bad, right? Because you should never hard code, you know, endpoints like that in your application. So, to see if you got the basic idea of Angular, instead of doing it like this, like, you know, specifying the endpoints of my services, what would be a nice Angular way of abstracting these endpoints and potentially other things? Exactly. I could use dependency injection with some kind of a config module, and I'll show that to you later today. So you see that That's a dependency. These kind of endpoints is a dependency. You don't want to hard code that. You want to inject that in this module. So you could totally do it through a module and inject that. So that you could also easily change your configuration between a test environment and a production environment and inject the right configuration. All right. Believe it or not, that's really all you need to do to define two REST services. So super easy because ng resource is really powerful. By default, it's going to know how to post, how to put, how to delete. So all these HTTP methods that in REST, terminology mean specific things. So like when you post, that means that you want to create an object. When you put, it means that you want to modify an object. All that is built into ng resource. You don't have anything to do there. So let's look at the controller. So if the role of a service was really to get data, the role of a controller is to oftentimes get the data from the service. So the difference here is obviously that the controller doesn't know anything about the actual data access strategy. I'll ask the controller, give me a list of sessions or give me a list of products. I'll get it, but I don't know at all how the service got the data. So that's a nice abstraction. And so what the controller is going to do next is put data in scope. And so this is an example of that. So I'm going to use here a controller that has a dependency on service. So again, this is the same syntax. This is a module called controllers. It has a dependency on the services module. So therefore, I can inject product in the controller because remember, in services, we defined the product service. And because I injected services, I'm able to use product here. And so you see that product automatically has a method called query, which is basically going to do a simple get, an HTTP get to that endpoint that you specified here, okay? And you see that I didn't have to specify that query method. It's built in when you use ng resource, okay? And automatically, with a syntax that, by the way, looks very synchronous, even though this really happens asynchronously. So initially, it's essentially going to be a promise that gets populated, when you get the data back from the service. So what I'm doing, product.query is going to return an array of products, and I store that in $scope.products. So that's the scope of this controller, and I can keep adding data into that scope, and anything that's in scope can then be displayed or rendered by the view, which in this case is essentially a template, okay? So for the template to be able to render data, the controller has to put that data in the scope. And that's really essentially the role of a controller. In the same way, for a template to be able to invoke a method, let's say that in that view there is a delete button. So that's a UI component. And you may have a handler, an ng click. And you say ng click delete item. Well, for that to work, the delete item needs to be in scope, and that's how you do it. Scope.delete item. In this case, it's a function, and you define the function. So let's look at the actual template now. So of course, this is just HTML. So you see that I can use here product. Why can I use curly product? Because let me do that. Well, I should probably, okay, here we go. Because I put products in scope, and here I use a directive. So this is what I meant by declarative. So this is a directive. So you see that you're basically annotating your HTML, ng repeat. So that's essentially a loop. You're basically saying create this div for every product in that products array. Okay? and products is in scope, so that's going to work just fine. Then you say curly, curly product name, it's going to display the name. And look here, I have a delete link, which is through styling essentially going to be a button. And it has an ng click, and on ng click you delete item. Why is that working? Oops. Why is that working? Because we put delete item into scope. So anything that you want to do in the view needs to be put into scope. Okay? So this is essentially what we did here. All right, so how many pages do you need to create in a single page application? I just want to make sure that you're still awake. It's not a tricky question. One, okay, there is only one page. However, your application has many views or many states, right? So one of them, okay, do I still have that? Oh, it's here actually, okay. So let's take a look at that actually. So you see the URL here. It's so localhost 5000, and then #/app/session. Okay, sessions. Then I'll choose one session, choose another one. So let's choose this one. Okay, and so now you see the URL. So it's #/app/session/tree. Too many S's. All right, so these are really just conventions. So the key thing to understand, and I'm sure most of you know that whatever, whenever you change what is after the hashtag is not going to generate a page refresh. Typically, if you change the URL, in the browser, it's going to generate a page refresh. But if you change anything after the hashtag, that's just information for you. The page is not going to be refreshed. And so these are really things that you use to create reproducible states in your application, okay? And so at some point you need to declare these states, and this is what I'm doing here. So I'm saying, for instance, well, if the URL is #/app, right, then you're going to use this template, and that's all. Just display whatever is in that template, and obviously this seems to be like a static page. However, in this state, if the URL is #/products, then you're going to use this template, productlist.html, with this controller. Okay, you specify the name of the controller. Remember, the controller is simply going to put data in scope so that the template can actually render it. So that's essentially the different components of Angular. So we work with modules. A module has dependencies. Typically, these dependencies can be controllers, can be services. And then you define routing, which is a way to reproduce states, different views, if you want, in your application. What Angular doesn't really do, so it's not a full stack framework like, say, for instance, jQuery Mobile. People are, oh, show me an Angular, header, or what does an Angular button look like? Well, Angular doesn't give you kind of UI-styled mobile components. So Ionic is a UI framework. If you remember my different layers, so Ionic sits at the top, in the top layer, the UI layer. And it's essentially kind of a UI layer on top of Angular. It provides you with a bunch of components that are defined as AngularJS directives. So they have their own Ion, it's like a tag that's kind of an extension of HTML, as I mentioned before, Ion view and things like that. Okay, but the interesting thing here is that it's not only components like other pure CSS based frameworks, it's also UI patterns. Like for instance, that sliding menu, it's, of course you have the styles of the component, but you actually have the transition and things like that. In a list, you can slide an item in the list and it's going to reveal a delete button. And that's a pattern that people working on iOS, for instance, expect. And so that's all built into the components. What we will see in a second, so, you know, it's super trendy these days to have a CLI. You know, if you don't have a CLI, I can't really take you seriously. So you need a CLI. Cordova has a CLI. PhoneGap has a CLI. Ionic has a CLI. The Ionic CLI, you know, is essentially kind of a superset of the Cordova CLI. So you can create a Cordova application using the Ionic CLI, but it has a bunch of additional things. Like, for instance, it has a way, and that's what you will use in 5 minutes, in 3 minutes, to start a project from a template application. So if you build an application that, you know, has tabs at the bottom, for instance, so there is a template for that. If you build an application that works with a kind of a side menu navigation, there is a template for that. And you can create these applications using the Ionic CLI. And the Ionic CLI has a bunch of other features that we will discuss. All right, so all the things that I said this morning about hardware acceleration and stuff like that are built in. What's interesting for people who have worked with the native SDK on iOS, you'll see a lot of similarities in the way the framework is modeled. So that's kind of how it is. What I like a lot about Ionic personally is that the design is very polished and it looks very much like a flat kind of new iOS style with, you know, a bunch of icons and stuff like that. So quickly, to give you an idea of what's available, so you have lists. You will use these in the lab in just a second, but it's more than just lists. You can, you know, built in, they are like these UI patterns that I mentioned before. So for instance, you can simply drag an item and move it. So if you want to reorder items in a list, that is all built in. You don't have to do anything, you know, in code to do that. Swiping to expose the delete, edit buttons, all that is built in. And believe me, if you had to get that right entirely programmatically, that would not be fun. So this is, you see at the bottom right there, this is what I meant by, you know, this is basically a kind of a component framework, but it's built on the directives architecture in Angular. So, you know, it's ion list, ion item. So you see how you augment HTML here. Tabs, again, with specific directives. Side menu, you will use that in the lab. Slide box, like if you want to do like a slideshow kind of thing. Action sheet. So all these components are built in, and even little subtle UI patterns, like how many people have ever tried to implement a pull to refresh in a list and get it really right, get it like native, you know, something like this. So all that is built in. And so that's really all I wanted to show you, because again, even though it's a cool framework, there are a lot of cool frameworks, so I'm not here to say you should use this one. I'm here to say, let's use this one in this lab, and so you'll have, you'll be exposed to one. But there are definitely many great options to build Cordova PhoneGap applications. All right, so with that being said, we will direct you to a lab that is at this URL. So it's in my GitHub repository. Can you guys read that? Yeah? All right, let's make it as big as I can. Okay. And so you go there, and once you're there, the hardest part of this workshop is to know how to spell Holly's last name and my last name. If you get that, you're in good shape because you have access to these resources. All right, so everybody's there? Yup. Okay. So maybe we can do a little bit of it together, and then I'll let you and Holly and maybe a few other people will be around, and I'll be around to help you when you need it. So let's go through a couple of steps together. So again, to install Ionic, it's npm type install. As I mentioned, Ionic is built on top of Cordova, and certainly the CLI is built on top of Cordova. So if you have Cordova, you're good. You don't have to specify Cordova here, but otherwise you do npm install G for global, Cordova, and Ionic. Okay, on a Mac, you probably will have to do sudo that. If you have an existing version of Ionic or existing version of Cordova that you haven't updated in a while, you may then do a sudo npm update Cordova and Ionic. Okay? So that will just get you started. Okay, so the npm install Ionic will essentially install that Ionic CLI. I'll give you a minute to go through it. How is the network holding up? Good. How many people were able to npm install Ionic? Okay. All right. If you have an issue, please raise your hand, and Holly and other people and I in a second will come around and help you. All right. If that is done, you can move to the next module. And here, you will install some supporting files. Essentially, it's going to be a node server that's going to give you the endpoints to the REST services. Okay, so not really, except that this lab works with a node server. If you have a quick way to create your own endpoints with another server, feel free to do it. But you don't have to write any node code. It's all built for you. So yeah, you're just going to start that server, that's all. So either you git clone that repo or you download the zip file. And then you cd to the Ionic tutorial folder that's going to be created either by cloning the repo or by unzipping the zip file. And then in Node, you are going to have to install the dependencies. So a Node server has, dependencies. In this case, I'm using the Express framework at the Node side. But again, if you're not into Node, that's totally fine. You just do npm install in the Ionic tutorial server directory, and it's going to install the dependencies. And at that point, you can start the server, Node server, and you're good to go. So at that point, you essentially have a server with a bunch of REST endpoints that you can use in the client application, and we'll do that in a second to actually access your data. Okay, so again, let us know if you run into issues here. So clone, unzip, or yeah, one or the other. Then you cd to ionic tutorial/server, npm install, and node server. At that point, you should be able to access localhost 5000/sessions, and it should give you a bunch of sessions in a JSON format. Okay? So if you're able to get something like this, that means that you have successfully installed the server. How many people have session data through REST? Super cool. Say that again. Yeah, it's just plain text. You're right. You're good. So that's kind of the basic REST service. Okay, so I'll give you one more minute to complete that. We'll be around, so I'll guide you through the first steps, and then we'll be around to help you if you get in trouble. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next module here. So I'm in module 3, where you create an Ionic application. And here is where some of the Ionic magic starts to happen. So you're going to use Ionic's own CLI here, but remember, this is just a wrapper on top of the Cordova or the PhoneGap CLI, if you want. Okay? And so I'm going to do that with you here. Oh. All right. So I'm going to open my own terminal here. Okay. And I'm going to go to pgday14. And so you're going to simply type here Ionic start conference, or you can code, this is really the name of the app, but don't stop there, because we want to use a template. Remember, we want that nice basic shell with a side menu. So this is how that works. Okay, so Ionic Start Conference side menu. Side menu is the name of the template you want to use. There are other templates like tabs, plain, and maybe others. Okay, but in this case, we want to use side menu. So this is very similar to what Michael demonstrated this morning when he used the PhoneGap CLI. You know, behind the scenes, it's all using the Cordova CLI, but with a few additional features on top. And in this case, the added value is to create a template project. Okay, so we're going to do that. I may already have that thing, so no, it's fine. Okay, and you see that it's actually downloading the template and installing some plugins, and then I'm done. And so at that point, I can cd to that directory that was just created, and if all goes well, I should be able to do Ionic serve in that directory. And if I do Ionic serve in that directory, look what I get. I get a nice little starting app with exactly what I wanted. Okay, so it has a list of stuff. Here it's just a playlist. okay? But it has the hamburger menu here, okay? And if I click that, it reveals my side menu with a bunch of options, including even login. Look at that. Okay, and I can log in. At this point, it's really not doing anything, but it's basically the skeleton for me to start building my app. It's kind of nice. Now, what is that Ionic Serve? I mentioned that this morning. You see, when I do Ionic Serve, it's actually opening a browser on localhost 8100. So Ionic Serve is essentially a local web server, okay? And it's starting your app in that local web server. Now, remember from this morning, why is that a good thing? Why start my app from a local web server versus the file system? Debug, maybe, but something more dramatic than that? Cross-origin policy. If you start your app from the file system and then try to use XML HTTP requests to load, say, templates, that's not going to work. In fact, you should even be able to test that. So if I go in that conference project that we created, it's here. Okay, you can experience that yourself, and you go in the www directory, and you try to load it this way from the file system. Look at what happens. It breaks. And why does it break? Because it gets into cross-domain policy issues. Okay, I can't use XML HTTP request if I started from the file system and then I try to use the HTTP protocol to load my templates. Okay, so this is why testing your application on a local web server is a great idea, and it's kind of cool that Ionic actually gives you that Ionic Serve web server that you can use to start your application. And the cool thing, like Michael demonstrated this morning in another context, is that that thing also has live reload. Okay, so if I go now change something in my app, you don't need to hit refresh. It's going to automatically refresh. So in other words, it's watching changes to files, and it would reload automatically. All right? How many people got to this point? Super cool. All right, so now, that is really great progress. So we created the app. So now, I'll let you complete module 4, 5, 6, and 7, which shouldn't take too long, and that's going to give you the app. So in other words, what we're going to do here, we're going to replace the dummy list of, the dummy playlist with actual sessions. So this is going to be your session list. Now, I was trying to find a better word than session, because session is confusing. A lot of people think, oh, are you talking about the HTTP session? No, session in this case means a conference session, okay? So don't be confused. So when I say creating the session service, it's really the conference session service. If someone comes up with a better name, please, I'd love a better name. Conference session, but that's kind of long. I don't know, class, course, whatever. But this is really what it is, okay? So the first thing that you're going to do is create a service, and we talked about that on my slides, to actually get the data from that node server, from these endpoints, and then in a few easy steps, you will end up with a conference app. So please go 4, 5, 6, 7, and we will be around if you have any question. And after that, again, I will walk you through the push notification. In fact, you can also skip 8, which is simply the building the project. If you have a device, feel free to do that, but also feel free to skip module 8. If you want to experiment with Facebook, go through module 9 and we'll be there to help you. We'll give you like some time to do that, and after that we'll resume the kind of the lecture with the push notification. So let us know if you run into issues. Okay, so we're going to do a quick debrief, and I'll give you some pointers to improve that application even more. Then we have a packed schedule. I'll do a quick push notification intro. We'll do a quick break. Jesse is going to tell you all about plugin architecture and how to write your own plugins. So that's going to be really interesting. Then we have PhoneGap Enterprise. Then we have PhoneGap Q&A. I think that's it. So very briefly, how was this? It wasn't too bad, right? In just a few, like maybe 30 minutes, you have a pretty good-looking application out of the box, you know, and of course you can continue to improve it, but I think, you know, to write quick prototypes, going to actual services, it was actually, you know, nice to be able to do that in 30 minutes or so. Some quick pointers to improve your application down the road. I have a version here that I modified slightly. Right now, you will put all your controllers in that controllers.js file and all your services in services.js file. Do you see a problem with that down the road as you're building a large app? Yeah, I do. These are not very modular files, right? Because you end up with completely unrelated services in the same file. You end up with completely unrelated controllers in the same file. So if you're building a larger application, it's always considered a better approach to write self-contained modules. So instead of writing a module with all the controllers, then another module with all the services. Who has a better idea? What kind of module could we write? I heard a session module, maybe a speaker module. So kind of a self-contained, you know, everything about speaker features in one module, everything about sessions features in another module. Now you have something that's really reusable and self-contained, okay? So I have a version of that I'll simply show you here. So see, I created a module that I called sessions. It has, you know, some dependencies. And then in that module, I have my routing defined, I have my service defined, and I have my controllers defined. And so this is now my sessions module. So there is nothing that says that you can't mix you know, controllers and services in the same module, and in fact, it's probably a better approach to encapsulate everything that's related to the same feature of your app in one self-contained module, okay? So that's something that I wanted to point out because all the Angular samples do controllers.js, services.js, but that simply doesn't scale, you know, if you build larger applications. Oh yeah, and the last thing that I wanted to quickly show you, and we spoke about that earlier today, you see that my sessions module has a dependency on config. And let's look at config now. So this is my config module, and it's simply a bunch of constants. Okay, so I basically externalize my endpoints here. You see that? I externalize my endpoint, so that is host. So that's basically where my REST services are. So now in my service, I inject host, and when I need to point to the resource, instead of hard coding it, I say host plus session/session ID. So this is how you can create a module just to externalize, the kind of the environment variables of your application. Question? Yeah, the session templates are basically better placed in their own file, a .html file, because if you do it that way, then you can edit them, if you give it to a designer, they can edit that using an HTML editor. So I think it's usually considered a best practice to kind of, keep templates in their own HTML files. Yes, that's a good idea. You can totally organize by directories then, and you would have your sessions.js and sessions.html in a directory. I think that would be a nice way to organize. Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, who is interested in push notification, adding push notification to their app? That's really a cool feature, and I wanted to quickly cover that with you. I have like 5 slides, but I'll go super fast. All right, so first of all, let's clarify what we mean by data push. Data push is not what you've been doing for years, maybe building, like trader desktops and stuff like that, where you open a WebSocket and you just push data to an open application. That would be the model that they use, for instance, in Uber to position all the cars to you. You have the Uber application opened, and then, there is some kind of a WebSocket open, and they push the information. That's kind of, traditional data push, and there are different protocols that you can use to do that, but that's not what we're talking about. The key difference here is that your app may not even be running. Okay, and oftentimes your app will not be running, yet you still want the user to be able to receive messages. Okay, so the app is not running, you get a message there. If the phone is kind of running, but if it's sleeping, it's kind of waking up and giving you a message there. So that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about. To be able to do that, obviously you see that there is a tight integration with the operating system, because in fact, the message, unlike my first scenario, is not pushed to your application, but the message is really pushed to the OS. Okay, and then the OS, the mobile operating system, is gonna do something with it. It's gonna send it to your app and potentially start your app if it's not running, right? So there is a tight integration with the OS. Therefore, that's, you can only do it in a native app, but as Michael mentioned this morning, a hybrid application is a native app. Okay, so you can totally do it that way through a plugin, and so we'll see how it works. So very briefly, I want to show you how things really work. So what you really want to do is this, right? You have some kind of a server-side application, and something happened, right? Maybe your Uber car arrived, and in that case, maybe I close my Uber app, and I just still want to notify the user that the car has arrived. Or maybe your friend shared something important on Facebook. Facebook is not open, but you still want to let your friend know. So that's, at a high level, what you want to do, but that's impossible to do because you don't know where that device is, right? So you're going to have to use a proprietary cloud service that's offered by Apple, that's called APNS, or Apple Push Notification Service, or by Google, GCM, Google Cloud Message Service, or something like that, or Windows Push Notification Service. And so your device, initially, the first time you'll run it, it's going to register with that service, providing a device ID to that service, and an app ID, because of course you want to isolate messages between apps. And in return, you're going to get a token. So now you have a unique token registered with that push service that identifies a device in combination with an app. Okay, so that's my device. Facebook on this device gets a token. Now the client has a token, but my server still doesn't have that token. So what I'm going to have to do now is speak to my server, which can be custom. Let's say I build a node server or whatever. And I'm going to let my server know about that token that I just received from APNS or GCM. Okay? I'm going to say, hey, I'm Christophe, and that's my token for this app. So that whenever the app, the server-side app, wants to push a message to Christophe, it sends the message to the token because that's the only thing that the vendor push service knows. I can't tell the vendor service push a message to Christophe. That doesn't mean anything for that service. The only thing they can push to is to a token. I can ask the push service, APNS for instance, push a message to token blah, blah, blah. That works. Okay? So the only language that I can talk to that vendor push service is token. And so at the server side, I will probably have some kind of a database keeping track of user ID token mappings so that when logically I want to send a message to Christophe, I will search by primary key Christophe, I'll find the token, and then I'm able to tell the vendor push service, send this message to that token. Does that make sense? And the push service can then do that. All right, so that's really the key thing. So I register with the service, I get a token. I need to keep track of that token somewhere at the server side and map it to my user ID so that when I decide that I need to send a message to that user, I retrieve the token and I ask the service to push a message to that token. And that token, in turn, maps to a device and an app on that device. It's a little complicated conceptually, but not that bad. All right, so let's quickly take a look at some code. All right, here we go. Okay. Okay, so there it is. So first of all, I need to install the push notification plugin. All right, so like any other plugin. So in this case, in the device ready event on my device, I'll grab a reference to the push notification plugin. So now push notification is a reference to that plugin, and I'm going to invoke the register method provided by that plugin. Okay? So register is going to talk to APNS or GCM, and in the result, I'm gonna get the token. So the next thing I do here, I make an AJAX call to my service here. So I hosted it on Heroku here, but that's just my own node application that's gonna keep track of token user ID mapping, and I send it my token. And now I'm good. Now I'm registered with my own server. So now, I'm going to show you the server side of that. Okay, and at the server side, so at the receiving end of that message call or service call that I just made from the Cordova app, so I'm going to register. I'm going to check if that token is already known. If that token is already known, I'm going to check if the user ID is the same. If that's the case, then we're good. If not, I will replace the user ID mapping for that token. So that I always have the right user ID for the specific token. So that's the registration part. But then when I need to send a message, I need to speak, I need to communicate with the vendor push service, okay? So they have some APIs that you can use for that. So Apple, so APNS, GCM has APIs, and that's pretty low level. Or if you're in Node, you can use existing libraries that will facilitate that process for you. And so in this case, I'm using a module called APN. Okay, so I require it, and then I'm actually able to send a message using the APN service. See, so I create my message, I query, and then this is really what's doing it. This line here is what's going to send the message to the service. Okay, so that's at a high level. Now, this is somewhat complex, so you need to write a server that does essentially two things, right? Number one, it's going to keep track of token user ID or token alias mapping. So you keep track of that in a Mongo database or a relational database, whatever you like to do, okay? So that when you decide that it's time to send a message to a specific user, you query your database for that alias, for that user ID, and you find a corresponding token, and then you use your service provider here to send a note, a notification to that token or to these tokens, because obviously you can send to multiple people at the same time. All right, so let's do a quick example of that. I'm going to try to stream my screen again. Oops, no, that's not what I wanted to do. The vendor service, so either APNS or GCM or WPNS. So when the application is installed on the device, you have to write some code through the plugin, through the push notification plugin to register with that service. Okay, so that's the code that I push notification.register is going to speak to that service, to APNS or GCM, and register is going to return the token. Okay, and then you send that token to your own server to keep track of it so that you can send message to that user. Messages. Okay. All right. Okay. And then I'm going to do this. All right. So I'm just going to illustrate that. So now this is a simple app that's going to just run the code that I just showed you. I'm going to say, hello, San Francisco, and we should get the message here. Here we go. Okay? So that's as simple as that. Now, I like to live dangerously because right now I deployed that as a wide open service, which is a terrible idea because who knows what you're going to push to my phone now. Okay, so please be nice. Okay, there is absolutely no security here. I just wanted to show you a bare bone implementation. Someone send me a test. Woohoo! All right, this is dangerous. I don't know how long I should keep that thing on, but all right. So that was that. So it's fairly complex to write that server, to keep track of that mapping, and to send messages. So the alternative is to actually use a third-party vendor that provides that service for you. All right, I'm too nervous now. All right, all right, all right. Here we go. Oops, Christophe. Oh, thank you. Maybe I'll leave it on then. All right, here we go. So there are things like urban airship. I think other services provide that capability. So if you didn't want to write your own server, to keep track of the, tokens and then push messages. There are services out there. Some of them are going to provide you with analytics. How many messages did you send? How many messages were opened by the user and stuff like that. So, as push notification becomes a real channel to engage with users, as always, you may want to get analytics around that and know, how successful, these campaigns may be. So that's something to consider. All right. So, yes, question? Yes. So, and that's a good point. So the question was, when you install the app for the first time and your app registers with APNS, you're going to get a dialog like any other native app that says, hey, that app wants to send you push notifications. Do you agree, do you agree, yes or no? You can always go back in settings, on your phone and turn that on or off. Right? Like, for instance, typically, I didn't do it today, but if I do a presentation and I need to stream my phone, I will typically go in the notification center on my phone and turn off a bunch of things because I don't want, tweets to show up on my phone. In the same way, for your PhoneGap Cordova application, you can then go back in settings, notification center, and turn it off there after the fact. Okay? Question? Yeah. So that's a good question. So the question is, if my server pushes a message to, the vendor service, do I have a way to know that it worked? Say that again, sorry. Yeah. I've experienced myself that, for instance, if I send a message to a token that doesn't exist, I will get an error back. So you have some level when you speak to these APIs with your vendor, you have some level of feedback. But if there is some kind of problem with the network, in fact, in many cases, they tell you in the licensing agreement that there is no guarantee that the message is actually going to be delivered. But you can definitely, from the client, you can go back to your own server and say, I got that message. So then you need to put the you need to put the pieces, connect the dots if you want, right? And say, okay, I send it, and my user app tells me that it got it. So in that way, you can reconcile the two, and that's how analytics are done and things like that. So yes, you have ways of doing that. Well, so if the OS gets the message, at that point, whether your app is running or not, it's going to be running because, well, if you don't tap, then, so I'm not totally positive, but I think the way analytics work is that if you don't get a ping back from your app, which at that point means the user opened your message, then you consider that it was not open. I don't know if you have the granularity to know why. Is it because it was not delivered, or is it because the user didn't tap it? I would have to look into that. I'm not sure about that. But you certainly can ping back the server when, the user opened the message. All right, so that was a lot of stuff. So we're going to take a break here, about 15 minutes. And then Jesse will come and talk to us about plugins, and specifically the authoring part of a plugin. So how do you build your own plugin? Is that right, Jesse? Okay. And then we will have another small presentation about PhoneGap Enterprise. And we will end the day with a Q&A with the PhoneGap team. So any question that you may have at that point. So let's take a 15 minutes break and come back, in 15 minutes. Thank you.